used to. We're finishing up chapter 1. If you remember last week, the introduction really is quite odd in the sense that this is the first time that God has spoken to Hosea. And the first thing that he says to do is to go and marry a woman of harlotry. And you remember we discussed how there's not really a whole lot of clarity on if she was actually an adulteress at the time of getting married. Partially because being an adulteress or an adulterer obviously would mean that you are in a marriage relationship. And yet in chapter 2 and verse 7 talks about returning to her first husband. There's also the Old Testament law that she and the guilty party would have been stoned. So there are some translations that call her an adulteress, but there's really no firm evidence that that was the case. Ultimately, though, even though this did take place, remember some people think that it didn't actually happen and it's just an illustration, it represents, God as the prophet in some ways, and Gomer as the people of Israel, and how in naming the children, their names came, to be not my people, or that they would be taken away from them. And so we're going to finish up chapter 1, just looking at verses 10 and 11. We'll read through chapter 2 real quick. That's only 23 verses, and then we'll get started in there. So, did anybody have any questions or comments before we started up again? Okay. The Minor Prophets are a great read. You can easily read them in one sitting. They're not that long, but beginning in verse 10, back up here. Verse 8, when she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, name him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Then what we're picking up today. Verse 10, yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it is said to them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. And the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together, and they will appoint for themselves one leader. And they will go up from the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. So the tone changes. In verses 2 through 9, Yahweh's commands, they dominate the signs, and he's no longer the speaker. Hosea's prophetic voice becomes prominent, and the theme actually turns positive. So we have all of this in verses 2 through 9 about these cursings and about you are not my people and what have you. But then we get into verse 10, and the signs, it starts to brighten up a little bit with salvation, not judgment, as the intended message here. In the book's basic structure of announcements of judgment and the promises of hope, they actually alternate. Right? Here, the rhythm is set really for the rest of the book, that even though it's really impersonal language, and I say impersonal because of the way that God is speaking somewhat, and the way that Hosea, when his voice gets in there, does, it's devoid of I wills. I will do this, I will do that. And that distinguishes it from other words of salvation. The I wills of God, right? God saying, I will do this, I will do this, I will do this. And so it seems that dwindles off a little bit as the message of salvation becomes more prominent. And so you might look at it this way. If you've ever been in any type of management, when they talk about coaching individuals, one of the big methods that they talk about using is called the sandwich method. And if you've been in management, you've probably heard that. It's basically that you start off with talking to your employee about something positive that they do, something that they're succeeding in or you appreciate about them as an employee or what have you. Then, after that, you follow into the quote-unquote constructive criticism, what they're doing wrong. But you don't want to leave them there, so you end on kind of so you're sandwiching the criticism in between, these two good pieces of bread. And so it's...
So they mostly don't hear that last ending part because they're thinking about what you just told them that was wrong.
Yeah, generally they're not going to pay attention to the last part. Or there are some people who you could sit there and say you're doing really great at this, but you're absolutely horrible at this. You're doing really good at this. And they'll walk away and say, oh man, my boss said I was fantastic. And so it all really kind of depends. But it's kind of the same idea here in a reverse sense. And now God's speaking, he's, okay, this is the judgment. This is what you're doing wrong. And then we get into this pronouncement of salvation that becomes the dominant theme. And the promises of restoration, they're framed in terms that are really reminiscent of the covenants that Israel has or had in Israel's past. First, there's the divine pledge, you think, to Abraham and his family, that it shaped the wording of the beginning of verse 10. Yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sands of the sea. If we go back to Genesis chapter 12, where that Abrahamic covenant starts, after he tells them, he says, God says to Abram at the time, in verse 2, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. You will be a blessing. And he starts talking about how it's going to, your sons are going to be like the stars, like the sand of the sea, and what have you, that they can't be counted. So that's where it first comes in, despite whatever destruction reduces their number in judgment. So it's interesting that God is saying, you're not my people, but salvation's going to be coming. And he says, the sons of God, they're going to be like the sands of the sea. So even though there is this judgment that is going to happen, it says, in a little while, even though there's this judgment, there's still going to be a great number. So even though you'll be judged, I'm still going to keep the promise that I made all those years ago, and that we would also see in Amos. When we get to Amos, then we'll kind of tie those together. So God's going to keep his word to the patriarchs and restore Israel's populace to a size beyond counting. This is a trial period, if you will, a pruning. You have this great number, but there are some of that great number who are not fixed on God. You think in the terms of the marriage relationship and with Gomer is that they're committing adultery against their husband. And no longer is God their spouse. And so they're going to be pruned, but once that pruning is done, their number is going to increase. Right? And that's still a principle that we see in the secular world and in the religious world. You can have a congregation, let's just say 100 people, okay? But you've got 20 people who are just really kind of bad apples in the congregation. They're the ones that are always negative. They're bringing everything down. They don't want to do anything. They really kind of spiritually drain the congregation, right? And eventually they leave. But when they leave, the only thing that's left are those that are strong workers, those that are spiritually steadfast, and what have you. And what generally happens, the congregation tends to grow. Right? And it's the same thing. You get rid of the bad apples, and, well, you start having a better harvest. So that's what God is saying, is you were once this number, There's going to be a pruning because there are so many that are rejecting me. But when that's done, your numbers will increase even more than they were before. But a lot of the people, they can't seem to see that. Just as we looked when we were looking through John at the Pharisees and scribes, there's just things that they can't see. But he says it's going to be like the sand of the sea. And it notes that the hearers would have understood the fulfillment of this promise. If there were any type of religious people, they would have remembered the covenant that God made with Abraham, because that is a staple of who they are as a people and of their faith. So that remembrance there at the beginning of verse 10 would have certainly sparked some remembrance. They would have also recognized it as a promise of return to this scale of national grandeur instead of being a slave to other peoples, given the similarity in the wording there. So the promise that follows is an expansion and explanation of the miracle of this vast increase in size. And it's the result of a new relationship with God, that there is a reconciliation with God there. We might liken that to us personally. Can we expect to grow spiritually if we are not in a current relationship with God? I'm not talking about being a Christian or not. Obviously, that should go without saying. But if you're a Christian but have somehow drifted away, not reading your Bible, not studying, not praying, not attending services, and what have you, can we really expect spiritual growth, right? And so here it is that there is this promise that after the pruning happens, there's going to be a growth of the people. Why? Because God will take them back because of God's long suffering, and he will take them back into this relationship. The sons of the living God. There's actually over in Matthew, get to it here, Matthew 16. If my pages will turn for me. I don't want to lick my fingers, while I'm up here. That'd just be disgusting. I'm doing it anyways. They can't turn. Matthew 16 and verse 16. There's a reference there. Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That we recognize that as part of Peter's confession. But the language there is the same. From the Hebrew to the Greek, the language is the same. It's talking about that covenant relationship of being brought in. And so the phrase, it catches us off guard to hear my people sometimes. Because really it carries 2 points. The first being that the living God is the one who will actually affect the miracle. And the second is it anticipates the defeats that are mentioned in chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. So it catches us off guard because of the way that the people are, the way that Gomer representing the people of Israel, and how they're going to flee to these other nations to look for help, won't find the help, and what have you. And then the second reminder of Israel's covenant, it comes there in verse 11. The sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together. They'll appoint for themselves one leader. They will go up from the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel, where they're reuniting of the kingdoms. Because remember, we were talking about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So we're talking about reuniting these kingdoms and the appointment of one head, one leader, which goes back to Yahweh's pact with David that was announced by Nathan in 2 Samuel chapter 7. The specific mention of David in Hosea 3 and verse 5 speaks to that. In just a few pages over in chapter 3 and verse 5, it says, afterward the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. And they will come trembling to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. So the kingdoms were divided. The kingdoms will be reunited under this one leader. As sin really marred the kingdoms and led God to withdraw his pity for the people. Right? It is so grace and the consistency of God, they triumph and they redeem the people. God is a long-suffering God, and he is patient. But there is a time when his patience wears out, right? And so he's a long-suffering God. He's patient. The people have committed, in the sense of this marriage, adultery. They have abandoned him. So fine, I withdraw myself from you, but I will come back to you and draw you back to me. Right? So there's the pruning, he leaves, and then he's going to be drawn back. The two kingdoms are going to be united. They're going to be united under one leader. So it really does show that. But we have to also consider that we do not want to be the ones when God has withdrawn that grace. Right? That's the thing of remaining consistent, right? There is a time when God lost his patience and he didn't speak to the people for 400 years. Now imagine if you were one of those living between the testaments, that blank page of your Bible when God was no longer speaking through prophets and what have you. You don't know if the voice of God is coming back. So you don't know if God has lost his patience for the final time or not. So it's a matter of remaining consistent. And if Israel had done that, then one, God would have never removed himself from them. But those that were consistent, even though it was removed, they were still there. They were not pruned. Does that make sense? Do I need to smooth it out a little bit? Okay. So Israel, we know they've had kind of a back and forth relationship with God, right? Even before the Exodus. There's, we have faith in God, we don't have faith in God. We believe God, we don't believe God. Well, when we get to Hosea, the kingdom of Israel is divided. We've got a northern and we've got a southern kingdom. Now we're really dealing with the northern kingdom. And God, through the prophet, he likens it to a marriage relationship, just as Paul does several times in the New Testament. And it's that the people of Israel, because of the way that they have acted, going after other false gods, committing sin, with no thought to what happens because of punishment and what have you, God essentially says, fine, you don't want to be part of me, I don't want to be part of you either. Just divorced, right, or separated. During that time of separation, God's grace and his care is removed. And some people, they die outside of that. When we get into chapter 2, and we're going to read it here in a moment, but they are seeking after these other people. Now, we have to recognize these other people are actually other kingdoms. You have Israel here, you have kingdoms attacking them and whatnot, so they're going over here for help and over here for help. But God says they're not, she, the nation, they're not going to find any help. So then at a certain point, because of that, they're going to realize that the only place that can help, the only one who can help is God. And they're going to recognize that together, and they're going to come together and once again become one kingdom under one leader. Does that help a little bit more? I'm going to just go with it does. If it doesn't, please let me know. So just as sin caused God to withdraw his pity on them, again, divine grace and consistency in that, it's going to bring it back. The one head is really a more general term used to avoid any ideas of kingship, of royalty in Hosea. Yeah, so any thoughts on chapter 1? And if you do have questions and you don't want to ask in class or something like that, that's fine. Just you can get with me afterward. And, you know. Okay, does anybody want to either start reading chapter 2, or you can read the whole thing, or read some and someone else pick up? It's only 23 verses. Okay, I'll tell you what. I'll go. Oh, go ahead.
Chapter 2, right?
Yes, sir.
Say of your brothers, my people, and of your sisters, my loved one. Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. Let her remove the adulterous look from her face, and the unfaithfulness from between her breasts. Otherwise I will strip her naked, and make her as bare as on the day she was born. I will make her like a desert, turn her into a parched land, and slay her with thirst. I will not show my love to her children, because they are the children of adultery. Their mother has been unfaithful and has conceived them in disgrace. She said, I will go after my lovers who give me my food and water, my wool and my linen and my oil and my drink. Therefore I will block her path with thorn bushes. I will wall her in so that she cannot find her way out. She will chase after her lovers, but not catch them. She will look for them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my husband at the first, for then I was better off than now. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for Baal. Therefore I will take away my grain when it ripens, and my new wine when it is ready. I will take back my wool and my linen intended to cover her nakedness. So now I will expose her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers. No one will take her out of my hands. I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, and all her appointed feasts. I will ruin her vines and her fig trees, which she said were her pay from her lovers. I will make them a thicket, and wild animals will devour them. I will punish her for the days she burned incense to Baals. She decked herself with rings and jewelry, and went after her lovers, but me she forgot, declares the Lord. Therefore I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the desert, and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards, and will make the valley of the anchor a door of hope. There she will sing as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and arrow and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice and in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth. And the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine and oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called, not my loved one. I will say to those called, not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God.
Thank you very much, sir. Really appreciate that. So, a little bit graphic, it seems, right? And that's one of the things about the minor prophets, especially when you get into it. They do not mince words. And it's interesting because this is God speaking. God is not mincing words, and he's trying to put it in a way that the people will understand. Very much Christ, when, I'll just say appears on the scene, when he comes in the flesh, and he's speaking to the people, he's using things that they can understand, in their own way. And the scope of this chapter, it seems to be much the same as the previous chapter, and it points to the same events and the causes. And so here, God, by the prophet, he shows their sin to them. If they did not know exactly what it was that they had done before. It's kind of maybe the husband and wife relationship. The wife is just quiet for a little bit, and the husband is always, "Are you mad at me? What did I do? You're not talking, what, did I do something wrong?" Kind of that idea, and she's just quiet the whole time. The guys are sitting there, they're slowly kind of nodding at me, but don't want to be too obvious because, their wives are next to them or something. Yes, ma'am.
That reading reminded me of what we read in Revelation about us being clothed in white robes,
Absolutely. We clothed in white robes, they'll sing a new song. No, absolutely. Absolutely. So it's kind of that idea in the sense of the prophet is saying, look, God is upset. This is what you've done. This is what he's going to do. And there's so much sin in their life that it's, okay, well, what did he have a problem with? What exactly did we do? So God, through the prophet, shows their sin to them, and it really hits home. The sin of their idolatry, their spiritual whoredom, as it is there. They're serving other idols. They're forgetting God and their obligations to him. Notice it wasn't just one thing, it was all of it. It was who they had become as a people, worshiping foreign gods, forgetting the sacrifice of them. And so he threatens to take away from them the plenty of good things that they had going for them, because they took those good things and started using them toward idol worship. It's very much as Paul wrote in the New Testament when he said that we're free, but we don't use our freedom to sin even more, right? Or when he's talking about grace, and he says, should we use our grace to sin more? And he says, no, God forbid. This is a prime example of that. They took the plenty, they took the freedom that God gave them, and so they slipped into worshiping other idols, sacrificing to them, completely forgetting God and who God is and what God demands, because they were so interested in other things. And I guess maybe a simple way to look at it, Gary and I, we were talking about this yesterday when we were up here to a degree, is you think maybe about people missing services, that it becomes easy the more that you do it, right? You might start off and say, well, I'm not going to go, I'm kind of busy, and so it starts that way. And you get whatever it is done that you need to accomplish, right? Well, that just makes it easier for the next time to say, I'm not going to go, I've still got other stuff to do. And then, well, I'm there for this time. There's nothing in the Bible that I need to meet about at this time or this time, so I'm not going to go to this time. And so eventually it ends up to where the person isn't attending services at all. And it's kind of the same idea. Now, that's a real simplified way to look at it. It's really kind of the only example that I could think of. But it's the idea of they didn't start off this way. It was just one thing that slowly built up and added to it. And the farther they got away from God, the more sin that came into their life, to where eventually they were people almost unrecognizable. And they're taking what God had given them and using it for a sinful life. And so he exposes that. He says, I'm going to take that away. But even though I'm going to take it away, he promises to at least return the mercy to them for his own sake. And there in verse 14, I will allure her, bring her into the wilderness, and I will speak kindly to her. And going to restore them to their former plentiful selves there in verse 15. I'll give her vineyards from there. The valley of Achor is a door pole. She'll sing there like she did in her youth. In the youth, obviously, because we're not talking about, obviously, growth here. We're talking about the way that she was before. You know, when that restoration comes, yes, I'm going to take it away, but I'm going to give it back. And when the people get it back, they're going to be and worship me just as they did before they had gotten off track. And going to renew his covenant with them there in verses 18 through 20, and to bless them with good things. So that 1 through 5, just rereading very quickly, say to your brothers, and I like the way that it was translated there, my people and my loved ones. In some texts, you might just see Emi or Ruama. It's missing the low part there. So the easier translation is to my people, my loved one. Okay? Say to your brothers, my people, and your sisters, my loved one. Contend with your mother, contend, for she's not my wife. I'm not her husband. Let her put away her harlotry from her face and her adultery from between her breasts, or I will strip her naked and expose her as on the day when she was born. I will also make her like a wilderness, make her like desert sand, and slay her with thirst. I will have no compassion on her children, because they are children of harlotry. Their mother has played the harlot. She who conceived them has acted shamefully, for she said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my bread and my water, my wool, my flax, my oil, and my drink. So the first words of this chapter, some make those first 5 verses, some of them actually make them the close of the previous chapter. Again, we have to remember that verses and chapter breaks, they weren't in there, for several hundred years after the time of Christ. And so some take those first 5 verses to go back to verse 1. And they add the promises that we have here, the great things that God would do for these people. God's spiritual Israel, made up of Jews and Gentiles without distinction. And we consider what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1. It's the power of God into salvation, right, to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek or the pagan or the Gentile, depending on your translation. Each one, Jew and Gentile, will call the other one brother and sister. There is no distinction with God. The people of God will be beloved of him. For that reason, they're going to embrace each other and stir one another up to give thanks and to walk worthy of that common salvation that they take in. The mother there in verse 2 seems to be the same as with the brethren in verse 1. The church of the 10 tribes, the body of the people who were the brethren, in a special manner with the heads and the leaders who were as a mother, by whom the rest were brought up and nursed. But the children, it says there, contend with your mother. Contend, or your translation might say, plead with your mother. Plead with her, because she is not my wife. So it's essentially the godly people that are among all of this widespread sin that's going on in Israel, that they had witnessed against the times. They need to boldly go and bear the testimony against the idolater. And it's very much the same here. And I say here in the New Testament sense, is that we have the spoken word of God. If we could look at it this way, the spoken word of God will take as the prophet, let's say, right? And we have a lot of people in the world who claim that they are of God, but they do not worship God. They do not obey God the way that He is. They are not actually His people. And God says to His faithful people, you need to contend with them. You need to plead with them. They say that they're mine, but they're not. You can tell them by their lives and the fruit of their lives. So you need to contend with them because they're not my people. That's really kind of the same idea. Contend with your mother. Plead with her. She's not my wife. I'm not her husband. You might not be a prophet, but you need to boldly go because you have witnessed what God has done. You know what God will do because He has told us. So you need to go and plead with those people. Any thoughts or comments?